and welcome back. Today, with our second programmatic plenary, we are taking a step back from our usual, more technical topics. The global pandemic gave the FSM Alliance an opportunity to reflect on larger institutional and systemic issues. Issues that contribute to the inequality we see in our sector and how this affects our ability to truly achieve citywide inclusive sanitation. The barriers are not just technical. We have so many brilliant engineering minds in our community. If what we face were only engineering challenges, we would have surmounted them. Today, we take a closer look at some of the intractable issues that prevent us from making the progress we all want to see in the world of international development and toward the goal of achieving SDG 6.2. So often, we become entrenched and inherited in systems and outdated paradigms that meaningful change starts to feel out of reach. As a community of innovators, this can be frustrating. We will hear from three individuals with various backgrounds in international development and vastly different perspectives on how they approach their work. Each will address a different roadblock towards advancement and share their thoughts on how we as a community can transcend them and clear the way for us to realize meaningful and sustainable change. Our first presenter is Jamilia White, who will challenge us to examine the systemic inequalities and built-in biases in historical and current models of international development. Jamilia is a racial equality and justice disruptor and global community development expert and advocate based in Washington, D.C. Through her work, she helps individuals, companies, and communities re-envision what development and social impact means through a community of practical approach. Jamilia holds a bachelor's degree in business management from Hampton University and a master's in public administration with a focus in economic development and international affairs from Indiana University. Through her work and her community commitments, Jamilia's life is guided by an underlying belief that all people deserve a dignified life. Please welcome Jamilia White.
I was 19 years old the first time I returned to Africa. I still remember the smell and the taste of the air as I departed the plane. I was a young exchange student studying French and business management at Hampton University, a historically Black college in Southern Virginia. My French teacher encouraged me to study abroad as a way to strengthen my language skills. I envisioned lounging on the beaches of southern France and indulging in French wine. But she introduced the idea to me of studying in Africa instead of France, to my surprise. See, I was a student who had a lot of intentions of working in the fashion industry at the time. But Dr. Moore saw my passion for justice and sent me to my ancestral home. In Senegal, I witnessed absolute beauty and absolute poverty for the first time, and both looked like me. My dreams of fashion quickly faded, and I accepted my life's calling in the movement for Black liberation worldwide. 3 years later, I returned to the continent after completing my studies to work for a small international NGO based in Lofa County, Liberia, following the country's civil war. At that time, Lofa County had about 275,000 residents. I would often babysit for my next-door neighbor and spend time with her, elders, and other women in the community, learning pre-colonial history, culture, religion, and so much more. It was there that I went through a reawakening, a rebirthing process. For the first time, I felt one with the land. It was so weird to feel at home to a place I never knew. At one of the many international NGO stakeholder meetings, someone was giving a report of all of the development assistance that had been dedicated to Lofa County for the year, and the number was huge, in the multi-millions. See, at that ripe age of 22, I mistakenly blurted out, "Where the hell did the money go?" Because when you looked around, Lofa was extremely depressed and underdeveloped, with a lack of basic infrastructure and economic opportunity. I said, we'd been better off giving everyone $10,000 to see what they could do and flourish, as GDP was well below $5,000 a year for that community. I quickly realized that cash disbursements were deemed outlandish in development and was scolded and told, if we just hand out money, folks won't be self-reliant, they'll be more dependent. The thought of African women not being self-reliant was the biggest lie I'd ever heard almost. And quite frankly, reminded me of a similar lie in America about the Black welfare queen, both racist and untrue stereotypes. I quickly realized how racism and oppression in donor countries reflected and played out in international relations, global power, and international development. I realized the racism in this. And so for the next 15 years, I had the pleasure of unlearning lies, relearning truth, relearning history, and fighting to dismantle systems of oppression, learning from the elders and my African brethren, and becoming one with the land. I come from a strong line of powerful women, and I think that's important to know where I come from so you can know how I got to this point. When I was about 4 years old, my mother, sister, and I, we moved in with my grandmother for a few years, and we grew very close. I remember and reflect back on the times that I sit with her while she combed her hair, combed my hair, and painted her nails, and told me stories of our ancestors. She told me stories of her mother, my great-grandmother Lou, and my great-great-grandmother Mary Jane. See, Grandma Lou, she was a bad mamma jamma. Around the turn of the century in Jim Crow South, she went from being a housekeeper for white families to a landowner, successful entrepreneur, continuously fighting racism and sexism in the Jim Crow South. My grandmother reminded me that I was only 4 generations removed from enslavement and only 1 generation removed from segregation, as my mother attended segregated schools until she was in the 7th grade. My mother and I graduated from the same high school, where only a few decades before, neither one of us were welcomed unless it was to cook or clean. But while the legal rules had changed, much else had not. As a teenager, I could still feel how very new this progress was. Years and years of systemic racism were very much alive every day, and it reminded me that so much more was needed. Over the years, I've been continuously reminded that I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, with their footprints guiding me and their spirit running through me. Through my grandmother's love and her stories, she instilled in me a sense of power, pride, responsibility, and purpose. I come from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is a symbol of hope, of freedom, of people power, and a beacon for equality around the world. It is unquestionably the place where decisions affecting the world's 7 billion citizens are made. From the Capitol buildings to Embassy Row, hour by hour, minute by minute, every day, international development is a topic of discussion here in DC. For me, DC is a beacon of freedom. But that freedom does not shine down from the huge colossal buildings or government offices. It comes from right here, from this actual community that I'm standing in today. It comes from the people. See, DC reminds me of Frederick Douglass, of Marvin Gaye, of Dr. Martin Luther King, who came here and stood on the steps of the Capitol, professed to the world that I have a dream. I've traveled around the world, but DC has been my home in more ways than one. This is my first political home. And what I mean by that is that this city has shaped and guided me to re-envision what empowerment of Black and brown people means. What it means for Black and brown people to be the drivers of the change that needs to happen in their communities, the change we want, the change we deserve. But right now there's a tension, a contradiction. Since the 1960s or so, DC has been dubbed Chocolate City due to the city's unique culture, music, flavor, and language, all infused from the large Black population. Since the 1960s, the Black population has hovered around 60% of the community, until now. Since 2000, the Black population has decreased more than 13% to only 47% of the city's population. 13% of Black DC has been displaced. And when you look at the outcomes for health, economics, and social, looking at the Black populations compared to the white population, the picture is completely different. white families have 81 times the wealth of Black families in the district. Black folks on average earn about 1/3 of the median income for white folks in the district. Years of racially discriminatory policies and practices in labor, housing, education, access to healthcare, and economic opportunity has resulted in the huge racial disparity that we have. Sometimes you can think of it as a tale of two cities. The same tension and contradiction I feel very much in development, where Black and brown countries have disproportionate health, economic, and social outcomes than predominantly Western white countries, and very little access to global markets. I've had to reconcile how I work in development, as I know that the problems we're trying to solve are inherently linked to the ways that racism and oppression have operated and guided decisions in my country and other donor countries around the world. And how allowing wealth to be concentrated for a few countries and poverty to be concentrated in other countries has led to this reality. How the exploitation of land and people for profit and wealth has led to this reality. So I've had to ask myself, what do I do and where do I go? All of this led me to believing in decolonizing development. And to decolonize development, I first had to start with decolonizing myself. Race is not real, it is man-made. Race was created around the 15 or 1600s during European colonial expansion to develop and maintain white skin access to power and privilege. We are 99% genetically alike, and science has proven that there's more variation within races than there is between races. Racism is a system. Racism is not a person, it's not an act. It's not doing something harmful to a person of color. It is a system. It is a system of advantage and oppression based on a way of organizing society, where one race has domination and other races have subordination. Our current international and domestic power systems were built on race, where people of color, particularly Black people, were at the bottom. So much of our history involves the murder of indigenous people for their land, their wealth, and then forcing them into invisibility while atrocities against them continue. Enslavement made it okay to look at Black people and consider them 3/5 of man. And since then, this anti-Blackness has prevailed and has been hard to overcome. So when I think about decolonizing development, the first thing I do is ask myself, why are we here? Who's benefiting from what we're doing? Who's making decisions? Who has the power? Who are we accountable to? For the projects or programs that I may have been involved in, who has the decision making? Where are the majority of the resources going? Is it to the community or back to donor countries? So when I think about decolonizing development, I first had to understand what was colonization. Despite the global focus on race and racism at the moment, the development community has been very slow to acknowledge and or center race in our work. We've been very slow to openly discuss and recognize how colonization and enslavement and the trade of 20 million African bodies have directly led to the conditions we see today. After 20 years in one country, generation after generation in the same development programs, we have to ask ourselves, do we truly want to work ourselves out of a job and leave the community? Perhaps a mutual dependency has been created. It's very difficult to believe that we're working ourselves out of a job when most organizations have annual revenue and annual income growth goals. How do you work yourself out of a job if you're always trying to grow? I don't know who said this, but it's so true. Everyone gets paid to engage communities of color, except communities of color. If colonization is taking over one's land, forcing them to assimilate, then claiming it as your own, then decolonization must be the opposite of that. So where do we start? Let's start with what I call the 5 R's. 1, recognize. Recognize, understand, and quantify the damage and harm that has been done. Repair. Repair that harm through reparations. Restore. Restore land to pre-colonial times. Redistribute. Redistribute global power and resources. And my favorite, reimagine. Use your imagination to create the world that we all want to live in. Adrienne Marie Brown says that we're in an imagination battle, that the conditions as they are now are a direct result of someone else's imagination. And we need to imagine a way forward beyond those oppressive constructs. Conforming and maintaining systems of oppression and inequality only takes away our imagination, making us accept things as the way they are, instead of thinking about what they should be. And why am I hopeful that this is achievable? Because every social change has been led by those who have been oppressed. And last year, after the world witnessed the horrific murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, millions of people around the world, from DC to Joburg to Istanbul, proclaimed that Black Lives Matter, in the largest civil rights movement in modern history. That my life matters. These global acts of solidarity, calling for an end of the current systems of inequality and exclusion, and for a new nation, a new world of equity, love, and justice. Because racism is a system maintained and created by people. And we, the people, have the power and the opportunity, while the world is watching, waiting, and ready to dismantle the current system and create the one that should be. Now, I know that can seem hard, and it can seem big, and it can seem challenging, especially for one person. But remember that you're not alone, that you're united with millions of activists around the world in solidarity. And that you just take it one step at a time, because change is ultimately the culmination of many small acts done over and over and over by a lot of people. So it starts with you. If I have to leave you with anything today, let it be this. Neuroscience has proven that the brain has the ability to learn and unlearn, to mend and heal multiple times. There's nothing stopping us. That ending racial inequality and racism is not taking something from white people. It's actually giving something to white people. It's giving them your freedom and your equity back. It's allowing the privileges and resources that you have to be shared with everyone else. It's to operate with compassion and love instead of competition and hate. My lessons of what's right, what's just, and how we should treat each other were learned at my grandmother's table. She taught me about healing, solidarity, mutual aid, and resiliency of Black and brown communities. What I learned from my time in Africa and around my grandmother's table is that the work for freedom and liberation for Black people started long before me and will continue after me. But that my responsibility, while I'm here on this earth, is to use my power and privilege to continue the fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamelia, for sharing your unique perspective on international development and the need to make our system more equitable for all. Next, we will hear from Rubaiyat Khan on the importance of recognizing people living in low-income communities as consumers with agency and buying power, rather than simply recipients of aid. Rubaiyat is the CEO of Gion, a health service delivery company based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Through Gion, he is working to bridge the healthcare divide for 100 million underserved rural people in Bangladesh by digitalizing, connecting, and mainstreaming pharmacies as a primary and quality point of care. He is also the co-founder of Empower, a social enterprise firm dedicated to moving the development paradigm into the information age. Please welcome Rubaiyat Khan.
Back in college, I was involved with a research project and had become quite close with study participants in a small village near Manikganj, close to Dhaka. While we were there was a massive flood that struck, and we had to evacuate, but not before witnessing massive destruction to lives and livelihoods, homes and schools being washed away, kids' futures becoming uncertain. So I came back to Dhaka, shocked, raised about $10,000 in donations, bought emergency relief, and went back to the village to distribute it. When I came back to Dhaka again, I felt like a burden had been lifted off my shoulders. I patted myself on the back, and I have since shared this story numerous times in my resume, in interviews, in statements of purpose, as an unqualified success. What I failed to mention, and indeed admit to myself, is that I never followed up on the impact of those donated funds. To this day, I still don't know whether the farms are back in operation, whether the people got back out of poverty, whether the kids went back to school. Now the question is, was I serving them or myself? Much of development work is done from a similar sense of duty, of altruism, generosity, an urge to give back. And indeed, it's a noble thing. But is it enough? To tell you why not, let me share 3 different stories. The first story is from a few years ago when I was working with a top international NGO, writing a proposal for a $90 million US project. The NGO had flown in an international development expert who did not really have much context, but she was amazing. We cranked out the proposal within 2 days. The problem is, we did all of it hunkered down in an air-conditioned boardroom and did not speak to a single member of the intended beneficiaries of that project. The second story is from an agriculture project in Bangladesh. The project was meant to increase access to information for farmers. However, pretty early in the project, it became quite obvious that even more foundational aspects were missing, such as reliable access to seeds, fertilizers, equipment. However, the funding from the donor side was earmarked, which meant that the project did not have any flexibility to change course and address those basic needs. As one farmer poignantly pointed out, should I sow paddy and eat rice or survive on information alone? The third story is from a well-known case, that of deworming. Study from Kenya, which was a rigorously done randomized trial, showed that deworming school children led to greater attendance and potentially even greater test scores. Based on that single study, tens of millions of dollars worth of deworming interventions were rolled out across the developing world. The problem is, study after study has since found that deworming does not seem to work as well in other contexts as it did in Kenya. And perhaps the interventions that it displaced, such as giving away free textbooks or giving sanitary napkins to girls, might have had greater impact in those other contexts. What is common across all of these 3 stories? What's common is that the beneficiary is conspicuously absent from all the discourses. Why did the beneficiaries not have a voice in designing, changing, scaling up, or shutting down interventions that would have such massive impact on their lives and livelihoods? In over 10 years of working with top development organizations in designing and executing projects, I've seen this same pattern play out repeatedly across contexts and across all the different stages of a development project's life cycle. In the design phase, there's often too little time, space, and resources to really dig deeply into the problem and engage beneficiaries meaningfully in the design process. In the execution phase, even if you have a flawless plan, it might not work on the ground for a variety of reasons. And the plans themselves and the budgets are often so rigid that you cannot do any meaningful course corrections, which means that gathering feedback from beneficiaries is almost a fruitless exercise. Moreover, the costs of an unhappy client is rather negligible, whereas your entire survival might be at stake if the donor blacklists you. Who would you be more worried about? In the wrap-up stage, impact is often measured shoddily or not at all. And when that fateful time comes, the best projects are just as likely to be wrapped up as the worst ones. Failures are typically shoved under the rug, and implementers and donors rarely have an honest conversation about what went wrong and why, and takes necessary steps to prevent that in the future. The field of development is actually an unmarked cemetery of thousands of such projects that were not designed right, implemented right, or evaluated right. And as a result, people, real people, suffered. And they never had a say in whether those same organizations got to work in their communities in the future. So, why does this happen? Because deeply embedded in the altruism narrative is a huge power imbalance, that of donor versus recipient, do-gooder versus beneficiary. Ask yourself this: if you call someone your beneficiary, would you really allow them to ask you hard questions or hold you accountable? If you can answer honestly to that question, you would realize why you would never see an old woman frustrated at her flood-resistant house washed away by the seasonal deluge, holding their NGO representatives accountable for the failure. Since they don't pay in cash, they must pay in unquestioning gratitude. The power does not lie with them in this implicit social contract we've built. The power lies instead with the people footing the bill, the donors. In our case, we bend over backwards to please them at every cost. In their turn, they're often all too happy seeing a few pictures of beautiful young children in front of the dapper new school that was built in rural Nepal. God forbid should anyone ask the parents of those children what the quality of instruction in that school was. Contrast this with a business where they would have to sell their products and services, and therefore they would leave no stones unturned to tweak the product and the offering to the taste and idiosyncrasies of their audience. And those greedy venture capitalists we often complain about, they would not bat an eyelid before firing the CEO if the needs and wants of the consumers were not being met. Why do we treat our customers so differently in the development sector? At best, we are oblivious to our assumptions and biases. At worst, we deeply and secretly believe that beneficiaries don't deserve a seat at the table. This deep-rooted inequality in the heart of development was too much for my naive, young, idealistic self. So in 2016, I broke away from the development sector and decided to pursue a private sector approach to addressing the rural healthcare challenges of my country. I saw it as a way to be on an equal footing with my clients. After all, my money would be where my mouth is. If I did not satisfy my customers, my business would fail. This simple shift in incentives actually led to a whole different way of doing things. I sought after funding that was unrestricted and flexible. I traveled extensively for countless days and hours in rural Bangladesh, talking to my customers, understanding their pain points, and co-designing with them. I created new ways of measuring their satisfaction with my services and measuring impact. I was brutally honest with my donors and funders about what was going right and what was going wrong. And I changed course whenever things weren't working out. The terminology changed as well. It went from my beneficiaries to my customers. And when beneficiaries don't have power, customers do. This is a secret I might regret revealing in a public forum such as this. But I sometimes still feel that I don't understand the problem well enough to have an intuitive grasp of what might work after working on the problem for over 8 years. So, what is the solution for development? At a foundational level, I believe we need humility. Donors, NGOs, and governments alike needs to realize how little we actually know about the problems we're trying to solve. And that we really, in order to really solve these problems, we need to understand them from the perspective of the people who face it day in and day out. And for that, the key is listening. A great example of this was the late Sir Fazle Hassan Abed, who founded BRAC right after the 1971 liberation war that devastated the country of Bangladesh. And he started BRAC with a very simple philosophy: solve the damn problem. Instead of looking at donors' priorities, He looked at people's priorities. When he gave out microcredit loans and people were failing to pay back because of their health challenges, he went out, listened deeply to these people, and came back and designed what became one of the largest nonprofit health programs in the world. Building from first principles, listening to those whose problems you're trying to serve, and acknowledging when you're wrong. That is the key. In addition, we also need new tools and methods for development practice. Human-centered design, rapid prototyping, A/B experiments. These are all tools often borrowed from the world of startups and business that can help us iterate and learn quickly at a low cost in order to maximize the impact for every dollar, while also giving clients a voice in the process. Another way to do this is to charge service fees to clients, even nominally, which can reverse the accountability dynamics and create a very visible measure of when a project is failing to provide an acceptable solution to the problem they're trying to solve. But we cannot do any of this if the system and its inherent incentive structures remain the same. So one example is from a USAID project that my first company, Empower, was running, where we negotiated with the donor to allocate the budget on an annual cycle rather than for the entire 5 years in advance. What that allowed us to do was to allocate the budget at the beginning of each year based on the learnings and experiences of the previous year. And this meant that we could iterate quickly at a low cost and run many experiments and eliminate and improve the flawed ideas. Donors need to set the tone and create such flexible structures for implementers to iterate effectively and learn from their experience. They need to break down the silos of funding that prevent funding from being allocated properly. They need to tune in to the beneficiaries directly and really understand their feedback so that they can hold the implementers accountable. They need to guarantee continuity of these programs. Unless we are bold and are ready to dismantle and rebuild development from the ground up, challenging our deepest assumptions, beliefs, and biases, much of the billions of dollars of funding we spend in development every year will probably continue to serve our needs of meaning, of fulfillment, of sustenance, rather than the needs of those whose problems we set out to solve in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubaiyat. Yours is an important reminder that if we are to provide universally safe and effective sanitation solutions, our services delivery model have to keep people, our consumers, at the center of the conversation. Our third presenter will speak to us about the importance of creating more opportunities for women in leadership roles in the sanitation sector. Euphrasia Luseka is a seasoned water governance expert who specializes in WASH public policy and institutional strengthening. Her work with both urban and rural utilities focuses on enhancing their overall creditworthiness and improving service delivery to at-risk populations. Based in Kisumu, Kenya, Euphrasia works with government, private sector, CSOs, and other development partners to design and implement programs with limited resources and deliver them with maximum impact. Euphrasia is a proven leader with an ability to engage across technical sectors to facilitate collaboration, share talents, and develop whole system solutions to water-related challenges. She has a flexible, forward-thinking approach and is a mentor to international development organizations and young professionals entering the field. Please welcome Euphrasia Luseka.
The United Nations defines diversity as difference. People are the same and different. Human diversity includes country of origin, family and ethnic background, age, culture, professional experience and training, religious and personal beliefs, personality, race, and gender. Today, I want to focus on diversity and the need for it, particularly in the pressing need for gender equity in leadership for SDG 6.2 from an intersectionality perspective. We need a more diverse labor force to establish a more inclusive and equitable development sector experience for all WASH practitioners. By highlighting the scale of issues facing female WASH leaders in the sector, we can better understand their challenges and galvanize action for progressive systemic change while examining other robust, potential, and scalable solutions. So, why should we do this? In 2020, a McKinsey report indicated that companies in the top quartile in the gender diversity on executive teams were 25% more likely to experience above average profitability than peer companies in the fourth quartile. The findings were even more compelling for ethnic and cultural diversity, showing that companies in the top 25% outperformed those in the bottom quarter by 36% in terms of profitability. Similarly, looking into the analysis of the employment data from participating organizations in the Flash LLC study, it is clear that diversity, equity, and inclusion in the global sector have not been the subject of extensive investigation or scrutiny. This study exposed that white males from the high-income countries comprised over a third of all leadership positions. With regards to race, 2/3 of the sanitation leaders were found to be white, with the white leaders 8.7 times more likely to hold multiple positions across different organizations than the BIPOC people. 88 out of the 100 organizations were headquartered in the high-income countries, and Western institutions dominated education data. BIPOC women were the least represented group. BIPOC WASH female leaders are missing out on opportunities in the development sector that holds the promise of advancement of the SDG 6.2 targets and the rising economic security that comes along with it. The consequences of not having women in WASH leadership. The financial consequences are significant. Elaborating this further with an example from my country, Kenya, the gap between available financial resources for the sector and the investments requirements remains huge. And about 90% of this funding comes from the development partners in the north. In a report shared in 2017 by Global Water Leaders, the WASH sector is losing $323 billion in a year on bad water and sanitation programs and projects. So the cost of coping with inadequate WASH access is rising faster than the utility investments in a sector with already dwindling funds. By and large, the extent of WASH failures, especially in the South, are attributed to the lack of women in the sector leadership. Research shows that when women are well represented at the top, organizations are 50% more likely to outperform their peers. Beyond that, compared to senior level men, senior level women have a vast and meaningful impact on an organization's culture. They champion diversity, equity, and inclusion issues more. Unfortunately, given the high male dominance in the WASH sector, they're also usually the onlys, the only one in the room, or the only one in the workplace. That comes with its own challenges. More sharper criticism to affirm their competence, more pressure to feel the need to working longer hours, and more experience to microaggressions. Here are some examples of what I mean. Many ambitious women want to advance into leadership positions. Very few have the support to assist them into getting those positions. Though many employees perceive themselves as supporters to BIPOC women, they do not take enough action, such as publicly advocating for racial or gender equality, publicly confronting discrimination, and publicly mentoring and sponsoring them. Women have the capacity to lead in the sector. There exists geographic mismatches between the female WASH leaders in the sector and opportunities, so they remain underrepresented and paid less. Though many organizations are hiring more women to entry-level positions, their numbers dwindle at management level, particularly for BIPOC women. A McKinsey report demonstrates this by exposing that women encounter the broken rung on the ladder to success and a revolving door in entry-level jobs, hindering their career advancement. This obviously has a long-term impact on the talent pipeline. Eventually, there are fewer women to hire, fewer women to promote to senior managers, and overall, fewer women in the sector. Women can never catch up with this status quo. Women, it is time for us to take up power. The central question of gender equality is a question of power. We continue to live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. Power is not given. Power is taken. We have to push back against the resistance to change, as advised by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Further, Kato Kelelitse, a female climate change advocate from Botswana, challenges, woman, take up space in your field of expertise and be loud about it. Your name should be the first to pop up in anyone is looking for someone in your field. Humility is costing us money. And we've had the call. Having women in WASH leadership is no longer just talk, it's success. Today, there are many exemplary women who we can draw inspiration and strength from. The 2020 Global Intelligence Report lists Liv Garfield as the most powerful woman in the water sector and indicates her impact in the sector as well. I am particularly drawn to the African women in the report, highlighting the Minister for Water and Sanitation, Honorable Cicely Kariuki from my country, Kenya, Lindiwe Sisulu and Anne Desiree Auloto from South Africa and Cote d'Ivoire, respectively, holding similar dockets in the national governments. I also add those that personally inspire me, those keen on young and BIPOC women in the WASH sector, because these are the future of the sector. My colleagues, Portia Parsley of USAID, Mariette Cohen of Women for Water Partnership, Katarina de Albuquerque of Sanitation Water for All, Katarina Fonseca of IRC, and Dr. Mira Mehta. You are in the right side of history. The work we are doing in advancing the human right to water and sanitation is frankly incredible. Undoubtedly, WASH organizations that have embraced diversification in terms of gender and race are positioned to meaningfully outperform their more homogeneous counterparts. Consequently, diversity, equity, and inclusion of women at the WASH workplace, especially of BIPOC women, has become an increasing priority for the development sector. Trends for both BIPOC leadership and female representation in the sanitation sector and the promotion have shown improvement. Specifically, after announcement of SDG 10, several WASH organizations have invested heavily on inclusion activities, both in terms of beneficiary activities and increasing female leadership and targets. However, placing a higher value on diversity and implementing targeted initiatives have not closed the representation gaps for women leaders in WASH, and especially BIPOC women, with most outcomes remaining elusive despite scaling up of initiatives. Overall, many organizations are stepping up, but many are not addressing the underlying causes. So how do we address these underlying causes? Effective policies are informed best by data. We cannot change what we do not measure, and we cannot measure what we do not know. Therefore, Firstly, and borrowing from President Biden's approach when he recently issued an executive order mandating that all government agencies in his country review policies to identify barriers to racial inequity and report this within 200 days, I would guide that all WASH organizations collect data to analyze their current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thereafter, inquire what actions can influence overall representation in the sector. And this includes representation at each level of the pipeline, inclusion and advancement of women from beneficiary level all the way to the headquarters. There needs to be an inclusive environment where women feel supported by peers and leaders. There needs to be an equitable access to opportunity, and overall there needs to be a vision for an organization's role in advancing opportunity for female WASH leaders, and mainly the BIPOC women across the sector. Co-creation will be key in strategically prioritizing interventions addressing necessary changes at the organization, leader, and peer levels. After all, progress cannot be made in silos. Collaborative efforts with external stakeholders to galvanize collective action will therefore be helpful. This will build trust across the organization, empowering and equipping management to not only develop but advance female leaders, and mainly those of BIPOC could follow. Reinforce and scale what works and reimagine what doesn't. Without diverse leadership, the sector will continue to experience failure, inefficient use of dwindling resources, and overall low sanitation coverage rates, with already 2 billion people lacking sanitation access. These issues must be urgently addressed to effectively meet SDG 6.2 targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Euphrasia. Our entire sector and the people we serve benefit when our leadership models are more inclusive. These three very important topics all influence the work we do in global sanitation. But how do these seemingly independent issues intersect? Next up, Jennifer Williams, Executive Director of the FSM Alliance, hosts a discussion with today's three presenters on how we must evolve our thinking and approaches in order to address the challenges we face in global sanitation.
Thank you all again for joining this discussion. It's been really great to hear and listen and read some of the remarks that you prepared. So I really just wanted to start off this discussion by starting with, I'm really curious about some of your own reactions and reflections to some of the other speakers' topics, or if you have any personal experiences that you'd like to add on of how you've experienced the topic yourself. Maybe Jamila, sorry not to pick on you, but I'll have you go first.
Both of the speakers' topics resonated with me, especially looking at the gender feminist lens as I tote back and forth between my intersectionality in this work, and then also looking at the power dynamics, which I think plays very much into what I talked about in terms of decolonizing development, looking at where decisions are being made, who pretty much controls the programs, and how local communities are being impacted. And so for me, it just really provided the opportunity to reflect. And it also provided some validation, to be quite honest, about the work that I'm doing and about this global solidarity around pretty much equality for everyone. And we've all seen how COVID-19 and this pandemic globally has exacerbated that inequality that we're all fighting for, and the dire need for systemic changes to be made around the world. So for me, those it was validation, it was reflection, and then it also gave me hope. And I started thinking, okay, well, this is what I can do in my work, and this is what I can do in my work. And so anytime that I'm inspired and I can get hope for action is always a goal.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess you, Jamila, I'm also curious a little bit on, I think a part of the gender and feminist discussion, race does play a big, it's a component of that. And I think going back to your point about the intersectionality, I was just wondering, because sometimes I have conversations with other women about the differences of how maybe American women or European women experience gender inequality. And I actually, when I was reading through Euphrasia's remarks, I felt like there was more commonality than maybe I hear sometimes sort of anecdotally. And so I just wondered if you had any reflections on that, and Euphrasia also as well, how we're sort of all experiencing the gender inequality coming from different places.
No, thank you. I mean, I think you hit it on the nail. There's more commonality in the challenges that we're faced as women or people who identify as women or women as I identify. And unfortunately, I think that sometimes our other differences, whether it's race or ethnicity, kind of clouts where that solidarity could be and how efforts could be. And one of the things I'm very cognizant of is making sure that I'm not trying to impose or convince or push my womanism onto other people or to other cultures. And, too often there's been tensions around respectability politics. What does feminism mean? To be a feminist, it looks this way, and it doesn't. Because these are not my words, but Black girls can Black girl any way they want. It's no way to Black girl. And so that goes the same for every woman and girl. There's no way to woman or girl. Women and girls can women and girls however they want. And unfortunately, I believe that we've let too many other systems of oppression and dominance clout that, instead of looking at the commonality that we're facing, because we're not each other's enemies. The enemy is a system that was created before any of us were ever conceived or ever even thought of. We have one common enemy that we all have to fight daily. And so it's about removing that, finding the commonality, and starting with that.
Thank you. Yeah, Euphrasia, reflections from you.
I would say from my perspective that I feel like we face the same challenges across in terms of women leadership in our positions, and this is affecting more of the BIPOC women. I would like to mention the challenges from the perspective of, we kind of have to work twice as harder, and in a way, this is just to make people to feel maybe comfortable, or maybe to attain their desires or maybe their thoughts of probably we couldn't be able to do this. And now we have to work a little bit hard to be able to show them that, we can be able to manage and all. So we work twice as hard. Whether you're in the South or whether you're in the North, we do it twice as harder. And again, when it comes to issues to do with the broken door agenda, most of us at entry level, especially for the technical sectors, most of us, we have so many women who are up for it. They take up the STEM agenda, but very few of them are sitting in management positions today, or very few of them, again, are able to now say that they stuck in the sector that they were studying in. This is a challenge that cuts across for all of us. So and then the other challenge is on the issue of glass cliffing concept. In terms of glass cliffing, we are seeing it a lot in the sector currently. It's like there's a push to have women in leadership, and people are not putting women there because, not actually putting, but you're not having women there because of merit. Some of these women are coming into these positions because maybe it's an emotional view to have them there, or probably, it's high time that you had a BIPOC woman in this position, or maybe it's high time that we probably had a woman. So most of these women that are in these leadership positions are not there because they probably worked hard for it. They are usually there because they were put there. And this is another challenge because some of these women don't really understand the struggle that the others have had. And in that regard, the women that are below them still also lack allies.
values in terms of those who are going to now come in to mentor them. Those are going to be holding their hand towards getting at a higher level. So the challenges actually cut across. And again, it brings in the need of seeing how we can be able to address this, and not again from a perspective of the South or maybe the BIPOC people and the other people in quotes, but from a perspective of us as one people. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, Rubaiyat, over to you for some of the reflections on the other topics.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think first of all, I must congratulate my fellow panelists for the wonderful talks and perspectives that they've shared. And while I was listening to them, I think I was almost hearing my own voice, because a lot of what they said sounded very similar to the things that I talk about on a regular basis. I think if I had to just distill it down, I think at the basic, all three of our talks is fundamentally about privilege and how blind privilege tends to make us to the fundamental inequities and injustices of the systems that we operate in. So we are all looking at it from, of course, different lenses. Jamila and Euphrasia, they're looking at it from race and gender, myself from the donor-beneficiary power disparity, but they're actually highly overlapping. There's you cannot really separate them out at will. So, but in fact, if you allow me to oversimplify, I think we could even summarize all three of our talks with just a single sentence, that the ghost of the white man's burden is alive and well in global development. What was the white man's burden? It was the well-intentioned do-gooder during the colonial times who considered it their duty to spread civilization to other peoples, while being blissfully unaware of the inherent problem of a person of privilege deciding on behalf of others what they need, right? So that hasn't really changed. Just replace the word civilization with development, and it's still all the same. Just to give you an example, and if I might be picking on Bill Gates, but just think of him as a very well-intentioned person who's of course contributed a lot to the development agenda globally. And of course, I personally respect him a lot, but you must remember that he is one private unelected individual who also happens to be an older white man who has tremendous sway over numerous governments and in turn their billions of citizens. If you just zoom one level up, you have to ask the question about the systemic problem inherent in this, right? Because where is the inequity? Where is the equity here? Where is the democracy? Where is the justice? What if it wasn't Bill Gates and someone like, let's say, Donald Trump, who decided to spend his fortune on changing the world's trajectory towards an anti-democratic, reactionary, regressive, racist ideology? Would we really allow that? If not, then is it morally right for any person, not just Bill Gates, to decide the trajectory of global progress? I don't believe so. So I think that's where, and I think this actually cuts across all of the topics that all three of us are talking.
Interesting remarks from Rubaiyat. I'd love to give Jamila or Euphrasia, I don't know if you have anything to add or respond to that before we.
Rubaiyat nailed it with his one sentence. And the one thing that all of us, are talking about too is the concentration of wealth and the concentration of power. And it's to a very few individuals. And what Rubaiyat said and giving examples of the Gates is 100% true. You have very, very wealthy people who are surrounded by, quite frankly, predominantly white people making decisions on how they're going to spend all of this money to help or empower the world's poor without even taking into account, well, how did I make my money? Did the way I make my money at all exploit or at all take advantage, or was all to the advantage of myself over these countries? And so I think also within philanthropy in general, we have to look at that dichotomy as well about how we made the money that we have in order to be able to do the philanthropic work that we're doing. And if it is to empower, then who's making the decisions at our table? Is it the family who runs the foundation, or is it the actual communities in which we're trying to get the resources to? And so those are hard questions. It doesn't mean that anyone is a bad person or there's any bad intentions, but as we grow and as we progress, change has to come. And this is a part of change, and this is a part of growth. Change is doing something different. Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and thinking we're going to get a different result. So I think, at least in this experiment, 250 years after enslavement has ended, we need to try something different. The first 250 years was an experiment. Now let's learn from that and try something different.
Great. Euphrasia, any comments to add from your side on that before we move on?
Yeah, I would say that his views in relation to what's happening in the WASH sector would be basically on issues on a concept that I usually call like parachuting of the staff. Of the Northern staff to come and maybe have this white savior type of approach or mentality in helping us to solve our issues. And basically what we've been able to see, especially during this COVID-19 period, is that probably we do not really need a white savior. Maybe we are our own saviors as BIPOC people, and let me speak as an African person. And by and large, we are saying that such mentality and such ways of doing things in development work or even in aid activities is really having a negative impact in the WASH sector. And actually, when you look at the WASH failures that we have, when you take it from a perspective of a systemic lens, you're going to realize that most of them are attributed to such type of programming that, again, by and large, just needs a decolonization approach. The Global Impact Report is indicating that we are losing approximately 323 billion per annum on bad WASH projects. And another article that I read from the New York Times, it's indicating that as we are speaking today, much as they're indicating all these challenges that we have, as we speak today, we have a rising class of middle-level Africans who are disputing such type of an approach on implementing activities. And these are including people like me, they're including civil groups, they're including the private sector, they're including the intellectuals who are now coming in to say that the white savior mentality cannot be able to work. After all, even in Africa, as we're speaking, we have like approximately 24 billionaires in the continent. So it means that we can be able to come up with our own solutions, but then at the same time, we're not also saying that we want to do it by ourselves. We want to also hold the hands of the Northern people, Northern again in quotes, Northern people, to be able to now get these ideas in a more sustainable manner. So that's my point. I've forgotten one more, but I'll remember it.
No, great. Thank you. I think one of the big themes that we saw from all of your talks was you're all thinking about some kind of transformational change and how we can actually do that. And some of you touched upon it, but I would love to just sort of re-hit on that again on what all three of you think is a key element to creating some of this change, either both tangible or intangible. Is it a concrete action, or is it a shift in mindset or philosophy or paradigm? So Rubaiyat, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll actually borrow Jamila's terminology here. So the first R and the last R. Recognize, of course, because first of all, it's about recognizing that we need a change in the value system, and we need to recognize the privilege that many of us operate with. We have to recognize when to give up power just as much as when to use power for good. And of course, the last R, reimagine, because I think we must think about how we might intentionally deconstruct and reimagine the systems within global development that are more conducive to ideals of equity, justice, and democracy. And how do we build an industry that reverses all of these power dynamics that we've been inherited with? How might we build racial and gender equality not as afterthoughts, but as a foundational strategy for development problem solving? So I think Jamila just hits the nail on the head, and those two R's really resonated.
Great. Thank you, Euphrasia. Something to add, a key element to creating this change that we've all been talking about.
Yeah, let me again bring it back to the wash sector. That's the sector that I work in. I would say that overall and indisputably, a lot of effort has been made towards ensuring that the wash sector is decolonized. A lot, and we have to appreciate that effort. But then again, when you look keenly into this effort, we'll realize that it only kinds of scratches the surface. So how do we ensure that this change can be more progressive and we again are not coming from so far and moving so little? I would say from this perspective, then maybe it's high time that we worked also on strengthening the policies on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when you look at this, I wouldn't say that we stop at it. Decolonization issues are beyond just creating policies and all. And when you look at what happened last year after Floyd's issue, so many organizations came up to talk about we are an equal opportunity employer and all these beautiful things that they said. But to date, if I go back to these organizations, how many of them have been able to increase the number of maybe BIPOC people in their organizations, you know? So where is the accountability beyond the policies that we're really putting in a lot of effort to design? So for me, I would say that beyond it and looking at this from a systemic lens, and again, thinking of it from the perspective of leave no one behind principles, and again, the perspective of SDG 10 in terms of reducing inequalities, I would say that beyond it, let us now move again and do like a self-examination of our mind. And if you look keenly into what Rubaiyat's explanation was in terms of taking a humble kind of approach and looking into ourselves, it's really an important perspective. You need to start by looking into yourself and asking yourself all these questions on issues to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Am I really for it? You know, and are there challenges? And what is my role? It doesn't matter whether I'm coming from the north or from the south. Let it start from there, because it's from there that you can be able to change your mind. If you cannot be able to change your mind, you cannot be able to change anything. So let's start from there. And then from what we have from that perspective, let us call the teams together. Let's have a co-creation session in designing these policies. Most of them are just designed as a close by the communication and marketing department, or maybe by the HR department, or maybe the corporate department. But is the team really involved? You know, does the whole organization really agree that we need to work on our decolonization agenda? So from what the team agrees and the content, or maybe a work plan or an action plan on the same, then let us finance it. It needs to be funded. Let's not assume it's going to be operationalized by itself. We'll need some funding on it. And from there, we move on tracking the progress of what we have been able to do. What I said from the beginning, a policy was designed, but how many BIPOC, maybe women or even men, are in the organizations, the organization itself? And then from there, let us now move into celebrating the success, you know, sharing the results. Let us hear that one organization is, you know, it has achieved, or maybe there's an organization, there's a company, Del Monte in Kenya. They are planning to employ more than 2,000 women by a particular period. I'll have to check the years again. So it would be such an interesting thing after making such a declaration to know how is the progress and what is the impact that this change has brought to the profits, or maybe anything else in the company. So I would say again, track the progress, let's remain accountable, and let us share the success for also other organizations to be able to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Euphrasia. Jamila, something to add from your thoughts?
I agree with my other two panelists, and especially Euphrasia's point, where it starts with the self. You know, I always tell folks that companies are made of people, systems are made and maintained by people, and it's up to people to change, and we can change. We know that. That's the only thing that's constant. As we work to reimagine and reconstruct, what a decolonized world looks like, what an anti-racist world looks like, one of the things that really resonates with me is looking at the way we relate to people and starting with that relationship and trying to work for a trust-based relationship and trust-based partnerships, and not looking at everything through this control and domination kind of lens like we see it now. And so that's one of the things that I work towards every day, and asking myself certain questions. How am I going into this relationship? How is this partnership turning out? I no longer believe in, win-win and all of these different business principles that pretty much has been ingrained into us, if you're coming from the US, but really looking at it from a much more community lens. And then lastly, as we do reconstruct, I truly believe that those closest to the problem should be closest to the solutions. And so what I say is that those who are and have been impacted and oppressed by these systems should be the ones who are leading and driving that change. It's not their jobs to do the work to convince other people not to think or be certain ways, but they should be driving the decisions that's going to be happening.
Thank you. I think you've given each of you have given us a little bit of what each of us can all do when we sort of return to our daily lives from this conference. I was going to say go home, but we're all at home. So I think that's what really kicked some of this off for me as well. So some of my own reflections and just seeing what was happening in the world, which is how I decided to reach out to all of you. And I wanted to keep this discussion a little bit more solutions focused. So the next thing that I wanted to ask all of you is, some of you mentioned some of the things that we can do to begin to start this change. And so I was just curious if each of you could just speak to some of the things that you're doing in your own work, or if there's any suggestion from a fellow panelist that you thought was particularly something that you thought you could implement or incorporate into your days. So Euphrasia, I will kick it over to you.
There's something interesting that, again, Rubaiyat had mentioned in his write-up. He said, at a technical level, we need new tools and methods for development practice. And he listed a few of them. I would go also to list only one, to add one on what he did, what he had mentioned. And on this, I would say, the moment I started to speak about decolonization issues, sector, at some point it was also met by a lot of backlash. But then I told myself, we cannot be able to transform the world or even transform the WASH agenda and or advance on SDG 6 targets by ourselves. You can't do it by yourself. We need people. And in that regard, there are things that we can be able to borrow from the North. And the North, again, has a lot that they can be able to learn from us as well. So how can we be able to continue to ensure that this relationship is being managed in a more sustainable manner? So in that regard, they came up with this different approach in terms of looking at this from a constructive as well as an optimistic way. And this is basically inclusive development. So in that regard, I would say that is the first solution that probably we need to have in the WASH sector. Let's design our agenda from an inclusive development perspective. And this way, we are not looking at SDGs in a silo. We are looking at them as one entity. And we bring in the perspective of SDG 10 as well. Now, when we are looking at issues to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, we again bring in the perspective of SDG 5. So we are not letting them be attained separately, but we are using all of them to be able to attain that main target of SDG 1 in reducing, alleviating poverty. So that is very, very important. And again, I feel like when we look at the issue from an inclusive development perspective, we are encouraging more reflections. We are bringing in responsibilities amongst the actors. We are also strengthening the relationships that we have, that Jamila has hammered from the beginning, and at the same time, we are bringing in some accountability. And this again brings a lot of ownership. It brings a lot of commitment in the agenda. And by and large, this is not a zero-sum game. if we win in the South, the North is also going to be winning. When you look at issues to do with climate change, you cannot say that a particular country is really managing it well and they're safe. No, whatever happens in the US is going to affect me in Kenya in one way or another. So regardless, we just need to see how we can be able to work together and inclusive development approach, and bringing in the linkage between the SDGs is going to really help us to create that mileage. Thanks.
Sorry, I was just reading an article. Thank you, Euphrasia. I was just reading an article yesterday that was talking about we've tried to take all of complex problems and put them into small bite-sized pieces to try to solve them at the granular level, thinking that we can then take all of those pieces and put it back together and that will create a solution. And the argument was we need to be looking at it as a whole picture first. And I think your point about not thinking about the SDGs individually really it was just something that came to mind when you were speaking. Jamila, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you. It's a few things that I am doing. One, I spent a lot of time over the last several years decolonizing myself and really unlearning and relearning everything. That's relationships, trust, how to work with compassion and love and not competition, and really understanding what community development is, what grassroots development is, inclusive development, and also just quite frankly, circular economics and what does it mean to have wealth not concentrated in certain communities. And so a few things that I did was, one, I decided to run for local office because I decided that with the help of my neighbors, in order to change policy, you have to be a policymaker. So it was time for me to get in the game. Fortunately, I won my election, so I'm in my first term as a commissioner here in Washington, D.C. Two, I left the industry. I decided to work differently to help decolonize the industry. So I use a lot of my platforms to talk about this subject and to get real with people. And it's a hard subject. And I know a lot that I say is probably going to rub people the wrong way. And, you know, I get called a racist all the time on Twitter and gets like little hate mails now, which is okay, because there has to be a human reaction. If there's no reaction, then there's no way to even start that change process. And that reaction is going to be probably negative or emotional to start with. And then I'm helping companies now to decolonize themselves and to work towards being anti-racist organizations. So that's what I'm doing professionally. And then just continuing my work with mutual aid, working throughout my community and understanding what transformative justice means, what does community solutions really mean, and figuring out how to tie that into the work that we do globally. And lastly, I'm working on very cool projects with some Black and brown women all across the world on these issues and looking at how we can be connected and networks more. But the one thing I do want to say about the SDGs, I like to challenge us to challenge those SDGs and to look at where all the responsibility lies, and to call upon global leaders to declare racism and oppression as global health issues, as global issues, and start there, recognizing how did we get here, and putting the concentration on countries that have the money, not letting just the SDG be goals about decreasing poverty if you don't talk about unconcentrating the wealth. So how can you decrease poverty if you allow wealth to be concentrated? For there to be a rich, there has to be a poor. For there to be a white, there has to be a Black. So we have to really think very, very creatively about the complex and deep issues that we have. So I say challenge that. Throw those, not throw them away, but challenge those. What are they rooted in? Are these really the goals that are going to get us there? Or do we say, how do we deconcentrate wealth and power from, you know, a handful of countries, and not just countries, but people, quite frankly, and give access to the rest of the world? Let's give reparations and see what people do.
Yeah, no, thank you. Rubaiyat.
What Euphrasia and Jamila said both resonates quite a lot. So as I mentioned in my talk, I think in 2015, I shifted away from the world of development and kind of tried a different way of doing things. And in my current organization, GEON, I think that's essentially what we're trying to do, although we don't use the same language, but we are trying to decolonize the process, and we are trying to give a voice to the people who previously did not have the power, and reallocating resources and power in a more equitable fashion. So that's been my journey for the last 5 years. I think on the gender front, I have more self-critical views, because I think if I look at both of my organizations, the leadership teams are largely male, and that's not for lack of trying. I just to give you one example, back in 2017, I was trying to fill my top engineering position, my CTO role, and I actually held out the position for about 6 months because I wanted a female leader there. And I wanted to set an example among Bangladeshi organizations where you wouldn't find probably a single woman CTO. I kid you not, I did not get even a single applicant. And then later on for another position, when I went out to hire a head of impact, I actually had to hire a female leadership team member from the US. I couldn't find one in Bangladesh. So it just tells you how badly the odds are stacked against women from a systemic level in some of our countries. And I think there's, of course, a long way to go to make it an even playing field so that women can rise to the top with fewer barriers and obstacles on the way. And I think even there, it actually starts from the home, right? Because if I may share a personal story, back in when I was going to grad school, I had just recently been married, and my wife was expected by everyone, from the families, from the society, to accompany me when I was going abroad for my studies. And she did go, and she didn't, at that point, we were too young to even question that, and to question the inherent kind of privilege that I had as a male, and the lack of power that she had as a woman. And over time, I think that has cost her quite a bit in terms of her career and her and progress. And so it took us 10 years, and like I have had to take a lot of time to actually start recognizing some of those privileges. And only now, last year, she went for a master's at Johns Hopkins, and the kids being with me, and that's like I think that's where the changes start, right? If the men do not take responsibility for pushing women forward, I don't think the balances can scale, the scale can even out. So it's really important that those changes start from home, and even before that, you need to recognize those privileges as a man, as a white person, in all those positions of privilege and power, where that privilege comes from and what your responsibility is to even out the balances.
Great. No, thank you for sharing that story and for some of these examples of how you're incorporating this in some of your work. These have been really heavy topics to bring up and discuss, and as Jamila said, they can be and Euphrasia, they can be met with some emotion, right, and maybe some negative feelings. So I wanted to close with a little bit of a more hopeful note. So I was just curious on what is one or two few things that you see that is giving you hope in this scenario. What do you see in the up and coming generation? I think what I personally am seeing is there's a movement growing, particularly amongst the youth. They are uninterested and have zero tolerance. And I find that a little bit refreshing because they're really just saying no. Not everywhere, of course. There's a lot of factors at play, but it was apparent right after the protests after the murder of George Floyd. So we saw those protests around the world, and that really became clear to me that this isn't just a U.S. problem; it's so much bigger than that. But I did also get a sense of hope from them. So. Jamila, over to you on what you find. What are some of the things that give you hope? Yeah.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say it's this generation. I love them. I mean, people are always talking about this generation. I'm like, are you crazy? They are smart. They understand technology, and they're not having it. And I love their fire. I love their energy. I love the way that they do movement work. And I'm just hoping that we can just continue to pour into them and give them the support and the resources they need to grow, to experiment, to fail, to take risk, because none of us have gotten this right. And so that's what really gives me hope. And I'll also say, mothers around the world, I have been so fortunate and inspired by mothers over the last year and the strength that they've just kind of endured to make do. We know that women, especially women of color globally, have been the hardest hit by this pandemic, whether it's economic opportunities or caregiving opportunities or them working in the industry and affected. But the resilience and the strength of mothers and women during this time has just been so overwhelming and amazing. And I found strength in that. And so I am hopeful by our youth and by our mothers. And I think that's a wonderful way to be, by those who give us life and those who are the lives that we give.
Thank you. Rubia, your thoughts?
On a hopeful note, I might be a little tongue-in-cheek here, but I think the entire averseness of the developed world from giving aid is actually cause for hope for me, because as they shift more inward, they stop oppressing and driving the discourse in other countries. And in our countries, we get to step up and actually fill that void. So I think that's a positive development from my point of view. And I think also the shift in balance towards more the social enterprises and impact investment, I think that also changes the balances quite in favor of the clients that I speak of, and gives power back to people because they get to vote with their wallets which solutions they actually want and need. And to Jamila's point, I think a lot of those social enterprises are actually very much youth-led and driven. And that also kind of shows how idealistically driven many of those enterprises are. So I'm actually very hopeful that these shifts in towards social enterprises and away from aid-based models will create a more fertile ground for problem-centered innovations and people-centered services. So I'm very hopeful about the future.
Great, thank you. And Euphrasia, over to you on what gives you some inspiration and hope during this time.
Well, let me speak about it from the African perspective. 60% of our population here is youth. And I believe that youth are our gold mine. And there is no one I've seen as beautiful as the African youth or the African child. So for me, what really inspires me through this whole agenda from the African youth perspective, I would say it's the courage that they have. The courage to be part of the history of decolonizing not only the sector, but actually all development activities in the continent. The way they are not being held back by the issues of age, by the issues of race, by the issues of gender, of religion. They are just so resilient. They have undaunted voices. They are loud. They are proud about what they are doing, and they are coming in very strongly to be part of history. Kofi Annan said, "You are never too young to be able to lead, and you should never ever doubt your capacity to triumph, even where others have not been able to do the same." And we have so many African youth who are doing an amazing job in areas where they were thought to be out of their league, and they're now actually making it to be like their own turf, you know. And I want to give an example of this. I want to start with William Kamkwamba. He's from Malawi. He's currently 31 years of age. By the time he was only 14, he had developed a windmill to produce electricity and water for his home. And actually his whole story is even on Netflix. And it moves beyond to even showcase how, you know, some of these SDGs can be met and what Africans are using in terms of just localizing the whole agenda of SDG 6. They're using what they have to be able to progress themselves. And also, I would also like to mention we have also this young boy called Steven Wamukota. He's from my country. At the age of 9, he built up a hand washing facility last year. So do we really need to say that we need someone from the north to come and really support even such simple stuff, you know? Steven is doing it at 9. It is not an automated tap, but it's still serving the purpose in terms of reducing COVID-19 cases. I'd like to also highlight a few girls, and the reason why I want to highlight them is affirmed by Thomas Sankara. He said that there's no social revolution that can ever take place without the inclusion of women. And these young girls are amazing. They're teenagers, around 5 or 6 or 7 of them. In my country, in Kenya, there's a group that came up with a whole app to support FGM issues, and they won an award. There's another one from South Africa. They came up with a whole it's a payload for a satellite that is supporting to improve issues to do with agriculture and food production for their own country. You know, the same is happening in Nigeria. We also have Malala and the likes. And when we just see young BIPOC women coming together to do such great agenda, it really is inspiring. So I would end by saying that fund us women leaders, whether we are children or we are youth or even older, fund us, and you're going to see wonders. Thank you.
No, thank you all so much. Again, thank you for sharing your time and your opinions and your thoughts, and thank you also for doing it so openly and vulnerably. I know we asked a lot of you, not just of your time, but also what to speak about. But so I felt like all of the topics were really important, and we're not speaking enough about it. So this is why I had reached out to all of you. I would also like to add, as a new organization, kind of trying to find our footing. We're just barely a year and a half old. I look forward to maybe coming back to you in the future to continue on how our organization can take into some of the topics and solutions we've talked about today, how we can use our privilege in a way that's positive, and also to continue the conversation, because sometimes we have these conversations isolated at a conference, and then we go away and we go back to work, and we don't think about it for another year or another 2 years. And so I think that's been also a detriment, is we need continued conversations about this regular, Euphrasia, to your point, the accountability piece. Holding ourselves accountable every 1 or 2 years at an event is not how we're going to truly be accountable. So again, just thank you all, and with that, we will go ahead and close.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that lively discussion. And many thanks to Jamelia, Rubaiyat, and Euphrasia for sharing your insights. We hope that today's session has provided some important context for how and why we must adapt the way we approach our work in the sanitation sector. The challenges before us are great, but we have it within us to make the necessary changes to realize the goals set out in SDG 6.2. That concludes our second programmatic plenary. Please check out today's agenda. New track session content is available, and a whole program of live interactive sessions. Keep the conversations going in the interactive forums. The competition with the FSM Mastermind is heating up, so test yourself and take the quiz. And don't forget to vote for your favorite World Emptying Challenge team. Enjoy your day. We hope you find plenty to keep you engaged today. We have something very special in store for you tomorrow at tomorrow's plenary. You won't want to miss it. Bye!